the work that we do is inherently democracy work. We are not only reaffirming the fact that these institutions should exist, but we are saying if you are going to exist, you need to deliver for us, and that we're not going to let you get away with what you've done if we have the evidence to prove that what you've done was intentional and nefarious. And we should change said policies, and we should chart a different future. And where we are right now as a country, a great reimagining needs to happen, and reparative justice has to be part of that conversation.
Welcome to 250 Years of Servitude. This is a limited series by the Black Veterans Project, part of the Dark Green Report. My name is Kamau Ware, and I'll be your host. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, yes.
Like telling us who you are, who you is.
Yeah. So my name is Richard Brookshire. I am the co-founder and the co-CEO of the Black Veterans Project. I'm an Army vet. I'm a Haitian-American, first-generation queer kid. Grew up in South Florida, lived in New York for a long time. Was in the military for 7 years, served as an infantry combat medic. And I'm somebody with a deep passion for racial justice, somebody with a deep passion for people and community and doing good for people in the world. And I'm an artist. I consider myself a storyteller.
Awesome.
And I'm a nerd, too. I
Word.
guess I'm real nerdy.
Nerd life.
I'm nerdy. A reparationist.
Word.
Another title. Yeah.
Nah, I love that. Like for every flower on your hat,
Yes.
you have those are all titles, right?
This is my Make Love Not War hat. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. And talking to some of your comrades and co-founders, you kind of come up as like a point of origins for Black Veterans Project. Would it be safe to say that you're an origin point?
I would say that. I think it depends on what it's been a journey. It's been around 7.5 years, so I think there's been different points of origin depending on what you're talking about with the work, but certainly I think some of the impetus for the work really came out of just general ideas that I had and hardships that I had and wanting to, I think BVP was born out of a desire to, one, be of utility, be of service to community, but two, it was also about taking back my power after a really powerless situation, after serving for 7 years, coming back to this country to see it deteriorating in the way that it was politically, but also me not being able to have access to certain levels of care and concern for the difficulties that I was having in transitioning back after Afghanistan. And then recognizing that I was part of a continuum, a generational continuum of folks across the racial lines who've served their country, and often their country hasn't necessarily returned that service with any level of dignity. And so, I guess my journey to Black Veterans Project, if I really look at its core, comes from my family, my mother and my father.
Okay.
Both of them are veterans. My dad is a Midwestern white boy from the middle of Ohio, the Plains. He grew up on a farm. He knew from middle school that he was probably going to have to go off to Vietnam and volunteered to enlist at 16 and went off to Vietnam, multiple tours, and saw all level of things. And dedicated his life to the military, served for over 20 years through the Gulf War, and met my mother in the early 80s when my mom's a Haitian woman. And she migrated from Haiti in the early 80s to be in the United States full time, even though she had been coming here since she was a child. Specifically Brooklyn. So all my Haitian family in Brooklyn.
Good place to come to.
Been there since the late 1960s. And she served for 3 years. That's how she met my father. And grew up, my first years, I was born near a military base. Grew up on a military base until I was about 5 or 6. My parents divorced, and my father kind of left my life. So there was always that knowing, and my most formative early memories being on a military base, seeing my father go off to war, being away for long periods of time, and just being steeped in what it was like to be, a child of the first Bush years, and then the Clinton years, with respect to our country's love for military conflict. And
was your father's have veterans before him and his family?
Yeah, my dad also has a fractured relationship with his father, but his father was a World War II veteran who who I think was based in Germany and defected essentially. Like essentially was like, I don't want to fight in this war, went AWOL. I didn't defect, I guess. He went AWOL, and then I think got kicked out or whatever, and then became a drunkard, from what I know, for the rest of his life. And so there's that legacy on that side. And then my father's family, at least from what I know about it, had been in Kentucky since like the late 1700s, were some of the first early settlers of Kentucky. Wow. But I probably need to do more of a deep dive on that side. But yeah, there's generations of service and being good old American, I guess. And then my mother being Haitian, there's that other thread. And so those formative experiences, I remember my mom had a portrait of her from basic training that sat on my wall growing up. I always saw it. So I always knew the military was an option. But I think the conditioning that I'd had about the military was that, you only really joined if you were poor, if you didn't do good in school. Right, it was a final option. It wasn't necessarily our best and our brightest. That was the conditioning that I'd had growing up in a pretty solidly middle class, mostly white neighborhood in Southern Florida. And long story short, I'd gotten a full academic scholarship to Morehouse. I went for a full year. Subsequently lost said scholarship because I was a first-generation kid, didn't really know how to navigate college, was dealing with mental health issues and coming out of the closet and all those different types of things. And then I had the ability to go to East State School in Florida, so I went to FAMU for a year because all my friends from high school had gone to FAM. And was there for a year, but was depressed about dropping out of Morehouse, so I ended up dropping out of FAM. And then it was around the time that Obama was running for president. And I remember seeing him on the cover of Ebony magazine at the time, and I went up to my mom and was like, yo, this is going to be our first black president. She was like, we ain't never got no black president. I was like, okay, he's going to be it. I'm like, I'm volunteering for his campaign. And so I went and I canvassed local areas in Central Florida at the time.
That's your first time having a taste of politics?
Nah, I've been a political kid since I was very, very young. I grew up with a Jamaican stepfather who very much reared in us, one, to have a very conscious, like a racial consciousness, to be very aware of what it meant to be black in America, what it meant to be black in the world. And I might be light bright, but he was very much like, you are black, and these are the things that you need to be aware of and how you traverse the world. That, and I grew up a little bit in Haiti as well, and I don't think you can be Haitian without having some kind of steeped in like what it means to be political. Right. It's a political project to be the first free
Black republic,
Black republic in the world, right? And so, growing up, I was in student government and involved in kind of local politics and in that way, and was definitely in student life always kind of taking on leadership roles. Even at Morehouse, I was, I think, vice president of my dormitory. Like, I was just always like, putting the events together and building community. It's just always been my thing. But certainly, I think on the presidential level, that was the first race that I had paid attention to. But I also saw myself in Obama. I looked up and I was like, oh, wow, like, he could be my uncle or my daddy. You know what I mean?
Or that could be me.
Or that could be me. That could be me. And I think that was also the inspiration. I remember when I won, my mom scrapped her money together and she sent me to D.C. Now, mind you, I just partied the whole time because I wasn't having no invitations to no parties, and I was like 20 or something like that. So it just, had a good time being in D.C. and feeling the energy of that first black president, and that all coming to fruition. And I think based off of like the inspiration from all that, I was like, okay, let me think seriously about a decision that I can make that can give me another opportunity to extend my education, to maybe give me experiences around manhood that I felt that I lacked. Like, I had a stepfather till I was about 15, but at that point I was a young man in the world and didn't have that relative guidance. Morehouse had been so transformative for me and gave me a deep sense of self, but that was no longer readily available to me.
Right.
And so I was like, okay, well, man, maybe I need some more formation. I need more discipline. So like the military seems like a legitimate option. And I'm like, oh, we got a black president, so I can trust this thing that I'm about to join. Naive. But still, that's what we do.
Learning and growing.
You learn and you grow. And so I joined up about like maybe 4 or 5 months after Obama was inaugurated. And found myself in I was in Mississippi. I was in Missouri for basic training, and then down in Texas to do my combat medic training. And then within about like 7 or 8 months, I was on a former Nazi base in the middle of Germany, and with a bunch of Midwestern white boys getting ready to go off to war. And that was kind of also the beginning seeds of me being. I always kind of knew about racial violence in America. I always also knew about like the history. I'd been an Afghan studies major even at Morehouse. But I think just being exposed to the level of ignorance that I was exposed to.
Ignorance in what way?
I think there's multiple levels of ignorance. There's like the kind of like prideful, you don't know what you're talking about, but you're speaking on it anyway. And then there's the folks that are purposefully, spreading animosity and hate for other human beings based off their identity, right?
With
And
ignorance and some
I
hate.
view that, and I view that as ignorant.
Yeah.
A lack of education or a lack of internal, structure really for yourself and a
Right.
good sense of your own. I don't think you can have a good sense of your own humanity and deny someone else's theirs. So
Right.
to me, it's always a decay of your own internal humanity when you decide to look at somebody and that's something that might be different from you and not see their full humanity because of it, not extend it to them. So, anyways, found myself on this former Nazi base in the middle of Germany.
And you have a grandfather, just like you almost retraces.
Well, I guess who had been there 100 years before and said, fuck this shit and left. But I said, I want an education. I'm serving the first black president. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do it well. And, I showed up every day and gave the best that I could for, about 3 years on active duty. And then I went to the New York State National Guard. But the seeds for Black Veterans Project, I think, were really beginning and forming then. I often talk about being in Afghanistan and a confluence of different experiences that I had up to that point, just being gay in uniform. At the time, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell was at its height. And it was, about to change, but it was definitely still being enforced. And also just dealing with other people's kind of the way that they would talk about Obama, like the things that they would say, the way that they, the passive ways that racism was just a matter of life in the military, and the ways that you may not get the same level of mentorship and care or concern by some of your leaders, the lack of investment in particular experiences that would make you be able to get promoted or whatever.
You feel it, but they don't say it.
Yeah, and it's unspoken, and you can kind of feel the tension after a while. But then there was also some overt things, like there were folks who had a deep fascination, they would say historically with the Nazi regime and Hitler. So they would be reading Mein Kampf at work, like casually, right? So like, don't bring a book about slavery over, but you could read Mein Kampf at work while you're trying to treat other soldiers, right? And I'll give a story.
That's a heck of a contrast.
Yeah, it's a hell of a contrast. And those seeds also for them planted fruit that I'll talk about a little bit later. But when I was in Afghanistan, I actually, we have a lot of downtime when you're at war, contrary to popular belief. Sometimes it can be very, very, very quiet, and then there's just moments of like just escalation, right? But for the vast majority, I was blessed enough to have a pretty quiet deployment. So I read a lot, and I read The New Jim Crow. And that really planted a lot of seeds in my structural analysis of like slavery and the American prison industrial complex and all of that. And then about 2 months after I got back from Afghanistan, Trayvon Martin is killed in the same town that I had canvassed for Obama in. And Trayvon also reminded me of my baby cousins. Like he just looked like them. Like they love Skittles. Like, you know what I mean? They would go to the corner store at night wearing their hoodie, talking to their girl on the phone. It's just something that like broke me. And I felt so close to that situation, and it was our generation's Emmett Till, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it awakened something in me, and I came back to the States, and I had been away essentially for 4 years through basic training, being in Germany, definitely on field exercises all the time, then being in Afghanistan, coming back and being away in Germany again. And so a lot of my friends had grown up there now, like 24, 25 in the city, moved to New York, whatever. So I decided to move to New York, went to finish my undergrad, and then decided to go to policy school. And at first, even I had kind of put myself on a trajectory because I actually wanted to go back to Haiti and do development work. So one of the things that was really formative about my experience in the military is I remember it was maybe the day that I got to Germany or the day after the earthquake in Haiti happened. And I had aunts die. I had my mom's nieces and nephews who were like second or third
I remember that
cousins
time. That was
or
very
whatever.
Tragic.
Yeah, some of a bunch of young kids moved to Florida. It was a tragic situation and feeling really helpless and feeling like I wanted to be there to help. And they were like, no, you're about to go to Afghanistan. You're not going nowhere. So that felt very disempowering. So I think part of in my trajectory in the military is like, I want to go back to Haiti and do work on behalf of my community and my people. And but in the middle of graduate school was really when Black Lives Matter started to really form and take shape. And everything from what happened with Trayvon to the real burgeoning of
so many parallel tracks for you.
Yes, and all of that was kind of happening and transpiring at once. I was like, there's a lot that's happening relative to racial justice here that deserves my attention just as much, and I began to pay attention to it more,
right,
and educate myself more, and expose myself more. And that all planted seeds. I think where things really took a kind of heightened increase was after I graduated. So I graduated in 2016.
And you were going to school where?
I went to graduate school at Columbia. So I studied urban and social policy at Columbia for 2 years, where I met Kyle, my co-founder, co-CEO. And
was Kyle the first person you met out of the group of four?
Yes, yeah. I met Kyle, I think it was the year before I started at Columbia. I was obviously interested in going, and I went to an event that was happening. I think the Students of Color organization, they didn't have enough black people to have a black student union at this policy school, so they had a Students of Color organization at the time. And they had put on a forum with former Mayor Dinkins, first black mayor of New York. And Kyle was in the audience, and I remember seeing him, and I was like, he seems like a really cool stand-up guy. And so we ended up building a relationship over several years. But when I got out in 2016, we hadn't really built a friendship yet. Like, I knew him from Columbia, but we hadn't really become friends. And so I'm getting out, I graduate, and I get out the military the same month. And within, was it 4 or 5 months, Trump is elected. And it's just this kind of like, okay, I came from having this experience of the first black president to the pendulum swing.
Oh, the
as
contrast.
soon as I leave uniform, and then trying to reconcile what my service meant, the state of the country, trying to transition into an experience that doesn't quite feel grounded, trying to figure out what does a career look like for me now. And I had some experiences in local New York City politics at the time where I got divested from the idea of working in government. I mean, I was like, okay, I wanted to potentially work in racial justice work, but could not find a role. I was this young kid, just got out of the military, had a policy degree, but who gives a fuck? And so like, my mental health deteriorated essentially for about almost 2 years, and I was trying in every which way that I could to get access to care, right? To talk to counselors and. Often my critiques weren't, oh, I went through the military and I was shot at and had a wound, and suddenly like that's where my PTSD comes from. It comes from, no, I went to the military as a young gay black man and barely survived that experience because there was a degradation on my spirit every day that I woke up. The kinds of things that I was surrounded by that made me feel less than, less deserving, less capable. That was certainly not deserved, because I had to work twice as hard as my peers to get half of what they got sometimes, which is a cliche story, but it's true. And that left me feeling quite defeated, but also now I'm in this transition period, and I don't have anybody to talk to about, how the sexual violence that I experienced in service, right? Or, as a combat medic too, you're dealing with people's psyche often. You're treating all these soldiers, but you're on the front lines of all of the issues that they're moving through while they're trying to show up for their jobs, and that took its toll. And then also just like kind of falling out of love with America, or the idea of what I thought America was as a child, to then kind of being a full-fledged adult, understanding the military-industrial complex and why we were even in Afghanistan at the time, and kind of taking off my rose-colored glasses to see the presidency in the way that was different, had more nuance probably. But all these things were deeply traumatic, and I didn't have a space to hold that.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, had a suicide attempt, and it was on the other side of that suicide attempt that the seeds for Black Veterans Project were like truly planted. Because when I was in the psych ward, I remember having a prayer, and I was like, God, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know why I survived, because I didn't want to. But like, if I'm here, give me something to do. Give me a calling. Point me to a purpose. And I really do feel like this work that over the last 7 years has been that divine purpose. And it's about connecting that generational legacy, because one thing I will say is that I'm a deeply privileged veteran as well, because there are generations that came before me, and certainly even folks now who are actively serving or have recently got out that face many more challenges. Go back to resource poor neighborhoods, don't have their mom able to come to New York and put them up for a year and help them rehabilitate, or they don't have anybody to turn to do, and so they turn to drugs, maybe to cope, or they become homeless. Right? They can't get a job. They don't have that rearing. They can't get into the best schools in the country for whatever reason, and then aren't afforded the same level of opportunity. And so I know that I had an obligation to all of those individuals that I'm now in a community with as a Black vet, to take the talents that I had, to take the knowing and knowledge that I had, and to try to do good work with it.
Right.
And so yeah.
What's the timeline roughly between Morehouse to the seeds of BVP that you just described? Like, what is that, like 11 years?
That would have been, it would have been like 12 years, because technically I left Morehouse in 2007, so it probably would have been 11 years. Yeah, 11 years, yeah.
A lot is happening different politically on the ground, and so I could imagine stepping back and like seeing exactly how one could have some challenges of like holding their sense of self together when you're in the middle of all those things and you're kind of repeating these cycles. You're back in Germany, all these things are like inside your body and like outside of you, and so like who's helping you?
Well, bringing it back
that?
to the Germany conversation. So one of the things that I talked about was folks reading Mein Kampf, and a very formative experience that I had. It was about maybe 3 or 4 months after I'd gotten out. I remember being on the train one morning and I'm reading a newspaper, and it talks about a veteran who became a white supremacist who came to New York with the explicit intent of killing a Black person, and he did. He went in Times Square with a sword and killed, I believe it was a Black veteran. This particular individual happened to go to basic training at the same place that I did at the same time. We were stationed in Germany on the same military base at the same time, went off with the same brigade at the same time, got out of the military at the same time, and our lives took very different paths. But I wouldn't be surprised if he was one of those folks, fascinated with the ideology of Nazi culture. There were still stones in the brick in some of the buildings at the time. Or one of the soldiers that I was talking about reading Mein Kampf casually that I was forced to serve next to. So that was a very formative experience too. And I went viral for the first time that fall. Without going into all the story, essentially my neighbor made a noise complaint against me, and I wrote a letter to the neighbor, and it got picked up by all the social media, like CNN and Washington Post and all of that. And then I had like neo-Nazis posting my address and saying they were going to kill me and hang me. And this is all happening like I'm a couple months out of the military. So all those experiences combined made me, and then the rise of the current regime, like made me very. It stirred my soul and my spirit.
Right. So is it safe to say like justice and repair are like pillars for who you are?
They've become pillars.
Because in many ways, we all heal ourselves. We get support, right? But if you're going through a process of going through like mental health challenges and you're able to walk through that, that labor's on you.
Right. Well, I also knew that, inevitably I was able to get access to mental health care. So that was able to kind of stabilize me. But I had taken advantage of all my educational benefits at that point. I'd gotten a master's degree all the way through a master's degree at Columbia and film school. I went to film school. And so I understood definitively like the impact that access to benefits could have, for folks that took full advantage of it, if they were given and gifted, not gifted, it's not a gift, given access to the benefits that they earned. And so I felt compelled when I was in the psych ward. I often tell the story about a book that I read, because I read tons of books, because that's all you could do in the psych ward. But I read this book called When Affirmative Action Was White, and it's by Ira Katznelson. If folks haven't read it, I think it's a kind of foundational reading. But they had a chapter about the GI Bill and the legacy of the GI Bill and how Black vets, about 1 million, went off to war during World War II and came back. And it's the advent of this policy that was created by the government to reward, those that went off and served and helped to win this war that many thought was unwinnable, right? And they gave them access to housing loans and education benefits that transformed the American middle class. The vast majority of Americans before World War II lived on farms. 20 years later, with access to the GI Bill, you have suburbs and cities being built, right? And access to...
And redlining, too.
Redlining, obviously. Where redlining was one of the policies that were propagated to block Black vets from being able to access the same level of benefit with the same effect. And that had generational consequence. in the billions and billions of dollars, estimated almost $80 billion in lost economic opportunity for the collective of Black vets that weren't able to access that benefit. And so it had resounding repercussions for economic inequality in this country. And then I also understanding my dad is a white Vietnam veteran, but a veteran nonetheless, understanding the Vietnam conflict, and that was the first fully integrated war, and the amount of Black vets that were being pushed out unjustly and then not given access to their benefits. So we kind of started the project in some sense. I came to Kyle and I said, there's this intergenerational legacy. We are of this generation of the digital age. There's no digital presence or footprint for Black veterans on the internet. At the time I was doing Googling, you could find one or two little sparse articles, mostly about the Civil War or, World War II. But there wasn't a really defined presence online, and certainly no real good storytelling. And I thought that was an opportunity for us to really plant some stronger seeds. But also I was a data nerd, and I wanted to try to understand the present day disparities. I wanted to understand them as deeply as I possibly could so I could understand the scale of the impact of not having access to benefits in the present day. And so the work really started to take shape 2 years into the project. The first year and a half, we went through an incubator program. We kind of concepted that we wanted to do some storytelling, some mobilization, build an archive, but it was just a loose idea and loose structure.
Definitely a journey, and as a founder,
Definitely a journey.
You were listening to 250 Years of Servitude, a podcast by Black Veterans Project. My name is Della Vanier. I'm a co-founder of the Black Veterans Project and an Army veteran. To learn more about our work, check out blackveteransproject.org.
Because we couldn't feed ourselves working on BVP, we went and took full-time jobs at veterans organizations, both Kyle and I. I went to Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, where I led communications for them. And then Kyle went to an organization called Common Defense. Shout out to both of those organizations. But the experiences at those organizations really helped us paint a much clearer picture about the landscape of veterans advocacy, how it works, how do how the cogs move, essentially. And 2 years in, we started a relationship with Yale Law School. They have a really prolific veterans legal clinic. And at the time, there was one VA report, VA being the Department of Veteran Affairs, a report that spoke to some of the disparities that Black veterans face very nominally. And I was like, there has to be more data. So in a conversation with the folks at the Yale Clinic, I was like, I would like to do a FOIA effort to try to get the VA to release more race-based data. And it turned out at the time they actually had never released race-based data relating to benefit access. So
Really?
In the entire history of the VA, we're about to be 250 years old. That's the premise of this podcast, 250 Years of Servitude, which we'll also get into. The VA had never been honest about actually how many Black vets have accessed.
But nobody asked.
There were plenty of people asking. There was a whole body created in the early 90s called the Center for Minority Veterans who had been asking for race data for 20 years. But they were a body that was convened by the government, so they couldn't sue the government. And for whatever reason, I often talk about the obfuscation of duty, it feels, that veterans organizations and also some civil rights organizations felt like they dropped the ball on the military, so that the fact that there wasn't an effort like this that existed prior to the founding of Black Veterans Project. Not about organizing. There are tons of folks that have done really prolific organizing around Black veterans, which I'd love to get into historically. But the fact that we hadn't actually had data to track about benefit accessibility until the advent of our project and our FOIA effort in basically around 2020 to 2022. And we had to sue for that information. And it ended up substantiating what Black vets had long known, like there was systemic and sustained racial disparities in benefits. We had sued to get access to data explicitly relating to disability compensation over a 20-year period, from 2001 all the way to today. So let me just take it back. So when you think about being a vet, you have to understand you get access to this app. The carrot that's often dangled is you get access to these things that give you pathways to the middle class: education, vocational and job training,
right.
Housing, housing stability, VA home loan. But if you get injured in service, you also potentially can get disability. You should be able to get disability for the ways in which you were impaired and you're going to be impaired for the remainder of your life.
Right.
There is a confluence of disparities that have persisted for generations with Black folks who are trying to get the compensation that they've earned through the ailments that they got through going to war for this country. And our project is about making sure that those families and those veterans are made whole. But we really want to make it's a data-driven project at its core. And we're using internal VA records and data and whistleblower accounts from people who work at VA to paint a picture of the fact that the VA had been grossly negligent in addressing how racial discrimination affected access to benefits, to the tune of upwards of $100 billion being siphoned out of the Black community ultimately through this confluence of different policies that ultimately locked unfairly Black vets and their families from accessing transformational benefits.
And is it most extreme when it comes to disability benefits?
I wouldn't say it's most extreme. I think the most extreme case is what happened around the GI Bill. And what happened around the GI Bill at the advent of World War II or at post-World War II and for the decade that followed, to me, has the widest and largest and most confounding effect, right? 80 billion of that $100 billion figure was just the consequence of being locked out of the GI Bill. But in the decades that followed, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Black vets that in different ways have been locked out. And in totality, we're probably surpassing more than $100 billion. But what we've been able to estimate thus far is at least $100 billion.
Do you think, like, whether you are, regardless where you come from on the spectrum as far as like your ethnicity in this country or your political perspective, do you find that people just kind of understand how large the problem is when it comes down to veterans and benefits and the disparities you're speaking of?
I don't think most folks know the nuance. Certainly, I didn't even know the nuance, and I was a vet myself. And so I think that's where advocates come in. That's where organizations like BVP come in. I think that there's a broader analysis that needs to happen in the country about the fact that our government is not serving the people in the way that it should, that we live under a military-industrial complex that is inherently a capitalist enterprise that is undermining the ability of most Americans to be able to feed, house, and educate themselves. And the fact that you have to go and serve to potentially be able to do that is egregious to begin with. And so I think that because most Americans are in survival mode and they're being fed all level of propaganda about what their country is and what this country has done to its people and continues to do for its people, they don't even have the bandwidth half the time to know the history of something to them maybe as nominal as like what Black veterans might be getting access to. When this robbery in some sense has affected large cross-sections of our society in different ways. But yeah.
So in many respects, and I know this from being familiar with the project, like reparations is a core part of the Black Veterans Project.
Yes. Reparative justice is a core part because I think that so long as we are going to continue in this experiment as a society, as a country, I think we need to reify our institutions and to ensure that they deliver on the promises made to the folks that are citizens of this country. And so to me, it's just the work that we do is inherently democracy work. We are not only reaffirming the fact that these institutions should exist, but we are saying if you are going to exist, you need to deliver for us, and that we're not going to let you get away with what you've done if we have the evidence to prove that what you've done was intentional and nefarious. And we should change said policies, and we should chart a different future. And where we are right now as a country, a great reimagining needs to happen, and reparative justice has to be part of that conversation.
Yeah, I think that I appreciate that answer. I met Cal at a Nerdy Thursdays event, and it's been free from like day one, going back to 2017. And people would say like, over the years, like, why don't you charge? And I was like, because we believe in reparations. Like, reparations? What I got to do with reparations? I was like, well, the root word is repair, right? And so if we've been like boxed out of so many things when it comes down to our history, knowledge of ourselves, one way of offering out repair is it should be a low barrier to come into a space, have a conversation, and learn about yourself. And so I think when you consider repair as a core part of the project, I think that there definitely is a need for people to probably take like two jumps to get there. And so where does storytelling come into making those jumps, to understanding a Black person's military experience, but also the issue with the benefits, but also how that then becomes reparative justice?
Conley Monk, why his story is important, I think it answers your question about the power of storytelling, the humanizing of the experience, because at some point, all this stuff just sounds like data points, and disconnected from the human experience and the human toll. So Conley Monk is the first veteran to take the data that we gleaned through FOIA, through Freedom of Information Act request, so government data, to prove that, or to try to prove in court rather, that the United States had been racially discriminating against Black veterans and had been culpable of gross negligence for not addressing how racial discrimination was affecting access to benefits. And he filed his suit about 2 years ago, and it's moved through a motion to dismiss, which makes it really historic. It makes it one of the first reparative justice cases of its magnitude to ever make it this far in U.S. courts. And it is poised to become, hopefully, the first race-based class action against the Department of Veteran Affairs for historical discrimination. So that's just a little bit of color to it. But Conley is a Marine veteran. Served 2 tours at the height of Vietnam, volunteered to go. His father, also a World War II veteran, so comes from a family of military service. His father had served and also didn't get access to the GI Bill, so that's important for context.
It's multi-generational.
Multi-generational. And so Conley finds himself at 17 volunteering to go over to Vietnam, and then he serves 2 tours. And at the tail end of his second tour, he gets into a fight with a white superior who calls him the N-word. Right? And they get into it. And the next thing you know, he's signing paperwork thinking, okay, I'm just a disciplinary action. I'm going to be able to go home. And he realizes, oh, shit, I actually don't have access to any benefits now. Like, I've gotten kicked out of the military. And he fought for 40 years, became a prolific veterans organizer in the state of Connecticut, but also went through many, many challenges. Some of the things, that I named earlier. And he, about 2 or 3 years before our project, was able to win a suit to finally gain access to his benefits. So the government essentially admitted, hey, you should have been getting benefits the entire time. So then he's taken our data to say, hey, actually, when he won that case a couple years prior to our collaboration, he only got about 3 years of back pay, even though the government had said, hey, you should have been getting your benefits since the early 70s, right? So he didn't get access to be able to buy a home and to see that appreciation over 40 years. He wasn't able to use his education benefits to either send himself to college or his kids to college. He wasn't able to get disability compensation, which at that point, by the time we started to collaborate, was well over $3,000 a month. That would have accumulated every month, for almost 40 years, right? And the ways he might have been able to invest that both in himself and his family and his community. And mind you, also, his father didn't get access to the GI Bill, right? And so he's making the claim that he is deserving of at least $1 million in damages for what he wasn't able to get access to. And the case has been moving forward and is in the courts now.
This is something that's fresh on my brain. Like, how much does one Tomahawk missile cost?
Oh, I don't even know. But I mean, some weapons in the military can cost upwards of $1 billion to produce. Nuclear, obviously, right? But but there are certainly average expenditures. I mean, we've almost had $1 trillion budget, or over $1 trillion budget. I think the next budget for to just annual pay for the military-industrial complex and us propagating war all over the entire world, and maintaining dozens of military bases and a whole apparatus that is robbing America blind, and we're not paying attention.
That is powerful storytelling. I think that you can visualize the cycles in the multi-generational situation with this person. What about storytelling when it comes down to the culture, when it comes to how people are seeing themselves, what are trending, what are different ways of how language shifts conversation? How is BVP's work looking at the culture when it comes down to telling these kind of stories and making people understand how it connects to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately we want to be a mirror to the ecosystem of Black veterans. Black veterans are not a monolith. Politically, aesthetically, culturally, they're all level of different types of Black vets. Black vets who are women, obviously, queer, immigrant, African American. And it goes on and on. But Black folks also still serve disproportionately, in our country. And so there's often conversations every generation about whether Black folks should divest from the military itself, and that's a whole nuanced conversation. But I think that ultimately there are still Black folks that are serving and that will continue to serve because they need economic opportunity, and it seems like a viable path when it seems as though there is no path other than maybe joining the military or potentially going to prison for a lot of folks. And so they take that path, and some folks actually benefit from some of the carrots that are dangled to them, right? And so they have a positive disposition about what that military experience is because of that. But I would charge them to have a little bit more of a structural analysis. But still, it offers them a pipeline to build wealth for their families, to move forward, to ascend, and what have you, and potentially, hopefully divest. So there's somewhere between 12 to 15 million descendants of Black World War II veterans. So most of them folks are African American, obviously. So like to me, it's automatically it's a conversation about the community because most Black folk I know.
What's that number you gave again?
12 to 15 million descendants.
I've never heard that before.
Right.
I'm one of them. My grandfather would fight in World War II.
Yeah. So quite a large number of Black folk have a direct ancestor that served just in World War II. But when you tie it all the way back to the Civil War or World War I or what have you, I mean,
so many.
The vast majority of folks would say, yes, they have an ancestor who served in the military and probably have a cousin today that's serving in the military. So it's directly correlated. But even if it's not, even if you can't find that familial connection, it's correlated because those expenditures that they're going to go spend at war and to go spend in your name are the reasons why you have to go take out loans to pay for healthcare.
Right, ask for
or
the cost of
the fact that you
missile.
went and put all of your college on credit cards and student loans,
right.
or that you're saddled with debt and that you can't afford to buy a house because privatization and all the other things that have happened since the GI Bill, right? So yeah, I mean, it's directly correlated. And I think part of the cultural conversations that we're trying to insert, one is about reparative justice. I think that we want to reify our democracy. We want it to live up to its ideals. We want our institutions to be able to deliver for people, right? And we also want to make sure that like there's a level of accountability and truth-telling about the ways in which our government has failed.
Right.
I mean, Kyle spoke on his episode about war being a failure, right? And so, yeah, like I think that those are important narratives to have. But I also want our society to begin to pay greater attention to what the military is, the apparatus of it, the people that serve in it, and how it might be used, how it might be being used in ways that they don't morally align with. And we have a responsibility. Our military belongs to the people. And if it doesn't, it becomes incredibly dangerous. Right? So and I want to continue to encourage people to pay attention and not look at the military as this kind of far away, distant, big man thing. No, the military is made up of us. We are the ones that have to go serve in it. And trust me, if we fight World War III, they're going to be coming for your sons and your daughters. So pay attention.
I'm thinking about Mos Def. When he's like, people were asking how hip hop's doing, like it's a giant in the hillsides. He's like, we are hip hop. Ask yourself, how are you doing? And that's what so I think that it might not be, once again, storytelling can help, bridge those gaps. But I don't think that people who are civilians or might not necessarily feel like they are invested in the military are actually understanding how much they are already a part of it. And I think that can happen with storytelling.
Most of our storytelling work to date over the last 7 years, mind you, we weren't full time. We were doing this kind of nights and weekends. It's been mostly through working with journalists, like making sure they had access to data. They had access to veterans that would speak on the record about issues of racial justice, racial inequity. There are hundreds of stories that we planted and had every reporter at every major outlet who gives a damn about Black veterans or veterans in general knows of who the Black Veterans Project is, and they come to us as a resource because we've become that resource, right? And I think that now when you Google Black vet, there's a whole another conversation that comes up on the internet, and I would say that we've played a large role in shaping what that dialogue is.
That's what's up.
And so now we are shifting a bit because we understand that we're at this critical nexus point, not only with our democracy but also with the case for repair, and we need to make sure that we're documenting the stories of these elders and our contemporaries who are still struggling to get access to benefits or facing issues of racial injustice in the military, that they have a space to tell their stories, and that it's told in the context of this broader history that America needs to understand, that every American should have some level of fluency in. Yeah,
I mean, I think to borrow a word we probably heard before from Bush, strategery, people who often think about reparations, they'll start at slavery. and say you owe us from all the free labor you received, or you might look at, things that were taken from people through violence as a form of reparations. And I think that probably one of the more tangible, realistic ways to get reparations for Black people first would be through these fresh documentations of like, this person served, should have got this, they did not get that. That's not 300 years ago.
Yeah.
That's my life.
Right.
And I think that it creates a bit of a case study or a bit of a scaffold to have that other conversation, but it's a place to also start. It might be like one of those initial successes that can like beget others. And so it's not super separate. Like when you think about veteran service and slavery, some might say those things don't belong in the same conversation, but you can make all those connections if you know your history or if you got the right storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I wanted to insert that dialogue about, the title of the podcast is 250 Years of Servitude, but there are direct correlations between slavery and military service, especially for Black people, right? Because, the folks who ended up on the front lines of the Civil War were mostly enslaved Africans who went to the Union lines and forced their way and said, "You're going to let me fight," right? And forced the Emancipation Proclamation because there were hundreds of thousands of them who were availing themselves to go and win and fight for their freedom, right? But being in the military is also this very interesting. It's an interesting experience in part because, like, even officers. You have a lifelong commitment when you're an officer. They can call you back at any point to go fight whatever conflict America has found itself wanting to be in, right? And then the ways in which like our military operate under a completely different set of laws, right? That aren't necessarily always reflective of like the progress in civil rights law that we've seen on the civilian side.
Interesting.
And so there's always been dual kind of roles there. But one of the first also real battles of real like the civil rights movement, one of the major first victories of the civil rights movement was the integration of the armed forces, right? And access to opportunities across the military industrial base around World War II. That was like what they were most focused on, not understanding they were getting robbed blind through inaccess to the GI Bill and just wanting to be part of the club, right? And I would say the same thing was kind of true nowadays, where it's like we're so focused on ascending and reifying the institution of the military and wanting to be part of it full-heartedly, not understanding the ways in which it's still not delivering on its promise to us about, I think the bare minimum that they can give people who go and serve and to the families that go in and put their whole entire lives on the line. Yeah. And their futures on the line to protect this experiment in democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know we've been at it for a second, but I feel like there's one thing we have to get to. And if I may, nerd out a little bit. I know this is, 250 years of servitude, but I also think about, 251 years ago, Lord Dunmore of Virginia made that proclamation that was like, if you are a Black person and you're enslaved and you join the Royal Army, you will be granted your freedom at the end of the war. And I think how that, in many ways, kind of galvanized and played a role in what eventually became the Declaration of Independence. You know what I'm saying? Like the year after that, the 13 colonies went from, we want to negotiate more rights for the colonies to like, nah, bro, independence. And it was actually like a bit of a insult to them that you would turn our enslaved people against us that way. And so when you look at Black people in 250 years ago, they were fighting for the British, like, I'm going to go ahead and do this route and get free, or middle class, whatever you want to call it. What is the middle class in that century for a Black person? Not being a slave, right? And so if you are working with the Royal Army or working with the Continental Army, they're both like, we're going to do this service in order to have freedom, better quality of life. And I think it's something that we don't talk about enough, that the British at least kept their word for the most part and did emancipate everybody that fought with the Royal Army. But on the flip side, we put people back into slavery. Right. And so I think that when you talk about Black veterans, I think people should understand we're discussing an issue that predates our nation. Right. And so we talk about the 250th, it's like, there's so much to get into.
Yeah.
And so I understand you're a storyteller, you're into the data, you're into the history. I think that this is a great opportunity for people to have those kind of conversations.
Absolutely.
And so I guess in closing, like what are some things that you're looking forward to having conversations about when it comes to like reparative justice, storytelling, the culture, and just like BVP, like, you know, let's say 5 years from now, like where do you see things going?
Yeah, I say one, I mean, I think about the reparative justice conversation in relationship to the British. I remember reading articles about how the British had essentially conscripted many Black service members from their colonies, specifically at the height of World War II, and never paid them their benefits. So there is a conversation to be had about reparative justice in Great Britain too, and I don't want to obfuscate that. But I think when I think about like the next like 5 years of BVP, there has been many Black veteran organizations that have existed, and really the where I find like the most history existing is in and around World War I, and those brothers that came back, about a few 100,000 of them, and many of them founded historic chapters of the American Legion or the VFW, and then became, you know, they had all manner of success at becoming pillars in their community and helping to ferment and build forward the Black race in this country. And the same, I think, is said around World War II veterans who did very much the same thing. Vietnam era vets. I think of organizations like Black Veterans for Social Justice, based out in Bed-Stuy, been around since the late 1970s, but was started by Black Vietnam and World War II veterans, and were really, you know, on the front lines of interventions to ensure that homeless Black veterans and Hispanic veterans and white veterans in the community were given access to care, that they were given a soft place to live. They had meals in their bellies and all of that, and do incredible work even to this day. Organizations like the National Association for Black Military Women, been around. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. They've been organizing Black veterans and Black women veterans for over 50 years. You have the National Association for Black Veterans. That's, you know, one of the largest organizations in the country that were organizing Black veterans. So there's certainly a long history. I think we're the first one to really insert the conversation about reparative justice at the core and the center of our organizing.
Yeah.
And we hope to be able to work with all of them.
Right.
So yeah.
Do you feel like there's something that like white people need to understand about Black military service that is like floating but like hasn't quite landed yet?
I think that in order to be a Black person who serves, there's a different level of patriotism that is required. And so not to say that I discount the service of anyone. I think anyone who serves this country is worthy of dignity and respect. But I do think that there's a different level of conversation when you talk about deciding to serve in spite of generational obstruction, not only to benefits but to dignity and equal civil rights, right? I think that there's a nuance there that is important to recognize, and I think that when you look at a Black person in uniform, you should have deep reverence for them because they're serving in spite of the fact that this country has never delivered for Black people.
Wow.
Thanks for checking out 250 Years of Servitude, a podcast by the Black Veterans Project. Check us out on Substack at The Dark Room Report, or visit blackveteransproject.org to learn more about our work.